Hi everyone, Molton here. Welcome back to this speedrun. And we're actually at around the 1650 level. This is actually a major wall for a lot of people when you find that a lot of people, once they reach this sort of level, they actually get stuck and they have trouble progressing further on. And I think one of the main reasons is because they actually find it a little bit more difficult because opponents blunder less, they play a lot more accurately, and in general they have a little bit more opening knowledge, and it requires you to play, put a little bit more pressure on them from your end, so things get a little bit tougher, I would say. In this game we're going to go for the Alapin. Could have gone for a Smith Morrow as well, that would have been interesting, but I'm going to try the Alapin because I think having the Alapin in your repertoire is really handy, especially if you're a Smith Morrow Gambit player, because a lot of the time the opening will sort of transpose back into each other. So we get into one of these main lines with the move Queen takes d5, which I find one of the more annoying options to face. And now black has a couple of different options. Black can go for bishop to g4 and also can play the move pawn to e6, which is a really solid try here for black. In general, these positions, white will end up with some sort of isolated queen's pawn in majority of the cases. So if you play bishop to e3 here, most of the time black will capture at some point. And then you'll develop your knight, chase the queen out, and then play off this isolated pawn. I'm not a huge fan of these positions. So the other option is also to take this pawn here on c5. I believe if you take the pawn on c5, they can trade queens, and there's some tricky lines here where black can play e5 and then you can play b4 to try and hang on to the pawn. It gets quite messy, but I think it's very playable for white. I'm going to go for those ones just because I feel like it's probably less common. So I'm going to take here. If the queens trade off, then I'm just going to recapture. If black takes the pawn on c5, these positions are generally quite good for white because I can develop my bishop with tempo, chase the queen out, and this knight can actually develop to a3. So it's going to be a very useful square for the knight, which will hop into, say, b5 or c4 afterwards. But I would say the critical test here is whether black takes the queen on d1. Other moves like bishop takes f3 are well met, I think, by just queen takes f3. And that would essentially force a queen trade. The double pawns here wouldn't matter so much. So I don't think you should worry about the double pawns because the most important thing is that we get this c5 pawn, which is most likely going to get supported with the move pawn to b4. And then we'll have like a huge pawn mass on the queen side, which is white's main idea here. And if we can get these sort of protected queenside pawns rolling up the board, that's where our winning chances will come from. Okay, bishop takes f3. So I think this is like an inaccuracy because now I can go queen takes f3. This is better than pawn takes because now if the queen captures on c5, I can actually take this pawn on b7, which is hanging. So now actually black can't even take the pawn on c5. So black is essentially forced to take a queen trade, but this is a very unfavorable one, I think, because now black can't actually win the pawn back. So I'm going to be able to hang on to that pawn on c5. So I can go bishop to e3 here, can also go b4. I'll just play b4 in case my bishop goes to b2. Should be fine. Probably I play knight d2 next and then bring the knight to either e4 or c4. This bishop can come out to b5 perhaps. So we just need to keep an eye out on these queenside pawns, make sure we don't overextend or lose these pawns on the queenside. That's probably the worst case scenario for us right now. So just keep an eye out for that. We should be fine if we play a3, I think. So if the pawn captures here, we can capture back with the c pawn, undoubling our pawns. Yeah, so here we go. We have to deal with this threat of captures, and then black capturing on b4 there. And then we wouldn't be able to recapture back with the pawn because the rooks would be hanging. So in order to meet this, I'm going to develop my bishop and pin the knight at the same time. Therefore, you can't capture on b4 twice. I think I'll go knight to d2 in this position. Let's continue my development. Don't see anything wrong with that. Okay, so now black has castled to moved away from this pin. So now there is this threat of captures. How do I deal with this? There's a couple of ways I could deal with this. I could move my rook. That could be an option. I could play bishop to b2. I kind of like bishop to b2. The only downside of bishop to b2 is I might allow this knight to end up on f4. But it should be okay. I also can still castle my king, so we shouldn't forget that I can still safely castle. So I think I might go for this. Let's play the move bishop to b2. The bishop looks bad because it's blocked by these pawns, but if ever black captures, I'll capture back with the c pawn, opening up the bishop. And if the knight gets to f4, it doesn't really matter because my focus is still on the queen side. So if I can castle, bring my king to c2, maybe even king to b3, the king will be really good on the queen side because I can sort of protect all these queenside pawns from being captured in the future. I'm expecting knight to d5 followed by bishop f6, just to put pressure on the c3 pawn. Not sure what else black does. I can also maybe consider taking this knight at some point later in the game. Taking the knight, maybe bringing my knight into c4. This might also be fine. Okay, so my opponent went for rook to d8, which makes a lot of sense. Now, my initial plan was to castle to the queen side. I'm just going to stick with that. I don't see anything wrong with that. I think it's a good way of getting the king to safety. At the same time, the king's actually going to protect these pawns. So everything is really about whether we can eventually get some passed pawn on the queen side. Knight to e5. So I suppose the idea of knight to e5 is to play knight to d3. So if I can play knight to d3, maybe he's trying to get rid of my light squared bishop, which is a pretty good piece, I would say. So I'll just play king c2 there just to stop knight d3. Okay, next maybe I can play c4 to open up this bishop, get the pawns rolling on the queen side. Can also play rook to e1 to attack the knight. f4 is also a move. The f4 probably knight g6, and I might end up losing that pawn on f4. For now, I'm probably leaning more towards c4, I would say. Some sort of c4 idea. Although c4 right away, he plays knight to d3, which is also annoying. But yeah, notice we're on move 15 so far in the game, and unlike many of our previous games at lower rating levels, our opponent hasn't really made any, I would say, tactical mistakes or any huge blunders so far. They've played some really solid moves, and even though they made some slight inaccuracies in the opening, it was nothing major, I would say. Also, using the time pressure to provoke mistakes is also really good, especially if you play a lot of, say, blitz and rapid. That's when it comes, I guess, knowing your openings well will win you a lot of time as well in the clock. Even if you don't get a big advantage or a good position every single game, you might win a lot of time on the clock, which will most likely help you later on in the game. Okay, so he goes for knight h5. It makes a lot of sense. Wants to bring the knight into the f4 square here and to cover up these dark squared weaknesses, which I've created. Now I think if I trade off a pair of knights, it probably will help me. So I might try to lay a tactical trap here. So I'm going to play the move knight to c4. Now the idea is that if black captures, then we just trade off a pair of knights, so this is perfectly fine. But if black decides to capture here on f3 instead, then we see that these two knights are actually going to be forked or skewered, I would say, if I can get my bishop here to e2. And how do I get my bishop to e2? I'm going to move my knight to b6, and I'm going to drop the bishop back to e2. So I'm going to set up a trap here. Play the move knight to c4. Now it's perfectly fine to do this, especially if the move doesn't hurt your position in any way. If the move makes your position worse, then obviously you shouldn't do it. But of course, if black takes, I also can just take the pawn. That's also another option I have. Okay, but black goes for it, so I'm just going to play knight to b6, go for the exchange. I think this is working. So, see, this was a tactical mistake, but it wasn't like a simple one, relatively simple one. I mean, you did have to see the move knight to b6 and then drop the bishop back to e2. It wasn't just straight up bishop to e2. So sometimes you do have to sort of set up some traps at this level, maybe set up some ways for your opponent to make some mistakes, and this will probably require you to be able to outcalculate your opponents. Okay, rook takes, rook takes. So rook goes to d8, then I'll play the move bishop to e2, which is the whole plan in this position for white. So here we can capture back with the king. This prevents any possible checks from the black knight, so then there's no knight e1 check I have to worry about. And now the skewer should win us a piece. Okay, so our opponent resigned that game. Okay, so welcome back to the analysis. So we're going to have a look at some of the theory in this actual opening variation. So after the move bishop to g4, this is one of the book moves. I think the main line goes bishop to e2, and after the move pawn to e6, usually white will play the move bishop to e3. Now we're threatening to capture the pawn on c5, since, you know, for example, let's say black plays the move knight to c6, I can just capture the pawn, forcing a queen trade, because now black can't capture back because I'll trade queens and then capture the bishop on c5. So because of this, after the move bishop to e3, usually black will capture, and then we'll get some position where black will drop the queen back. And I am not a huge fan of these positions for white. I think it's pretty comfortable for black in general, because it's quite difficult for white to play these positions because you have the isolated pawn, and it means that you have to create some pressure on the king side immediately in order to make things happen. It's definitely playable, and I'll probably end up playing some games in this type of positions just to show you. Generally I prefer to do this though when the pawn is on e6. Sometimes I will go for this sort of position. But with the move bishop to g4, I tried something different this time. Let's go pawn takes c5 just to show you this variation. It didn't end up happening, but black can actually trade off and play the move pawn to e5 here. Very tricky move. And the idea is that, well, I have to protect this pawn, right? If I don't protect this pawn, then, well, my whole idea doesn't really work. I need to get this pawn protected so I can try and create a passed queenside pawn later on. But after I push it, then black has this idea pawn to e4, utilizing this pin on the king. It's a really strong move. But white can survive in this position by playing the move pawn to h3, and after the move bishop to h5 maintaining the pin, white can actually play this move pawn to g4 to break the pin. Now if black just captures here, then I just capture the bishop and I'll clean up the pawn on f3, probably just move my knight and capture it, and black is totally fine. I have the bishops and the queenside pawn majority. So usually what black does is he sacrifices the knight, and after pawn takes, bishop takes, has this very annoying pin on this knight. And in order to get rid of it, usually white has to go knight to d2. We have the move pawn takes, and then let's say white could play a move such as king to c2 here, and we get a very interesting middle game where even though it looks like our king side is completely decimated, it's very difficult for black to push these pawns up the board immediately. It's something he can do later on. There's always a potential for these kingside pawns to roll up the board, but for the time being, the queen side is looking a lot more dangerous than black's kingside counterplay. So white would just follow up with knight c4, bishop d3, develop this bishop, and then look at ways to start pushing these passed pawns on the queen side. And not to mention black is still uncastled with the king. So this was essentially what I was going for here with the white pieces. Now if we go back to the game, after the move pawn takes, bishop takes, queen takes f3, now this is like a better version of that variation I just showed you, because now we get everything we got in that variation, but we don't have to worry a bit about the kingside pawns, or we're not even down any material. And from here on, we're just trying to protect that queenside pawn majority. Castles here is a very nice move. Just don't forget you can castle. And here we just have to make sure that the king is protecting these pawns on the queen side, and we should be good. Knight c4. Idea is to trade off pieces, because if we trade off pieces here, it should help us simplify the position and simplify the endgame, making it a bit easier for us to try and win. And we set up a tactic here though, which our opponent fell into after knight takes f3, knight b6. It actually likes this move we mentioned earlier even more, knight takes, which makes sense because we're attacking the pawn on b7. But went for this one, and then yeah, we get this bishop to e2 move at the end, which is skewering the knights. So I hope you guys enjoyed this game in the Alapin and learned something from this variation. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all on the next game.